Because what's most important is what we do. It's the differences we make. So the ethical perspective is very highlighted in this way of looking at theory and practice. So you have a holism, and it's very normative. Now then you have a dialectical perspective, and the dialectical perspective is what is the perspective I speak of, or speak through, or emphasize, or manifest right now. And it has changed. The boundaries between theory and practice in this perspective are changing. So we don't speak of any ontology, we speak of an epistemology, because it's not important from this perspective to underline what is of any undiscussed truth. That's not the point. From a dialectical perspective, it's a matter of perceiving, it's a matter of understanding, it's a matter of analyzing. So in this perspective, theory and practice are both descriptive and normative, but I must say that Jorgensen actually emphasizes this descriptive part higher than the normative part, and that becomes also a problem. Because the problem with the dialectical ways of understanding theory and practice, and that's the problem for these bachelor programs, is that when you look at the political intentions, it's very often, it's very clear that the intended relations between theory and practice are dialectical. But a dialectical perspective on theory and practice does not guide action. It does not tell you what to do. And when I look at my students, they keep asking me, what should I do? What's best to do? And this is not the most efficient way of have guided action. That you would have guided action more clearly in an evidence-based schooling or a more ethical-based schooling than in the dialectical-based schooling. So I have students that I forced to study and read and make their projects in this perspective, but it won't take a second, and they will be speaking of theory and practice in this perspective. That's not necessarily a problem. The problem is that they do this without us talking about it. What I'm trying to move on to is that we need to be better at articulating how we, in different ways are changing how we perceive theory and practice. And that's okay.
So you mean that the role of somebody educating, for instance, social workers, is more so to make sure that the student of social work, for instance, goes through a number of those positions and perhaps becomes aware of these positions?
It doesn't necessarily need to go through all the positions, but both the lecturers, students, and mentors need to be aware of that there are these different positions. And when somebody is arguing for something, it could be explained by saying, oh, that's because now you are looking at theory and practice in this way of relating theory and practice. So that makes sense. That makes sense why we disagree, because I'm looking at theory and practice in this perspective. Mm-hmm. So we don't necessarily disagree, but there's something ahead of us. Mm-hmm. And that ahead of us is acknowledging that we speak of theory and practice relations in different ways.
But Lars, this is very interesting, but this is still philosophy. We need to educate, or rather we need to develop new educational structures aimed specifically at social work. Now, how?
Can I ask something?
Yes, sure.
But in the previous slide, I didn't understand this point of fusion. Why this methodology are normative? Can you explain to us? I don't understand.
It means that when theory and practice is fusing together, and as there are no boundaries, and theory and practice is a kind of a holism, it is because theory and practice is not interesting in this perspective in themselves. It's not interesting what you can do with theory, or think of with theory, or do in practice. What's interesting is how they are related and what difference they can do as they are related. And what difference should they do? They should do the difference in guiding us towards the better life, the happy life. So this is the ethical perspective. Without integrating theory and practice, you will be led astray until instrumentalism or activism. So you need to integrate it into moving on towards the better life.
Yes, but how methodology can be normative in this form of relation between theory and practice?
It can't be normative in the way that it is focused on what action should we take. So that is the methodology. So it's focused on changing behavior, changing thinking, changing systems, changing organizations, changing moral. That is the aim, the objective. So that moves on to how it's in a methodological way are changing too. But I will move on to what I've actually been asked to do today. And that is to say that me and my colleague wanted to develop what we call a theory and practice didactics. And in the theory and practice didactics, we have 3 parts. And that is obvious enough, because I've been arguing for this for the last 20 minutes, is that lecturers, students, and mentors get an understanding of these 4 ways of looking at theory and practice relations. But it's also a part of the theory and practice didactics is also to view situations that you are in the study program as workshops, as something that is of a value in itself, of something that will guide you to see what is in principle shown in this particular situation. If we focus on the situation we are in, let's say right now, you are sitting down, I'm standing up, I'm giving a lecture, you're taking notes, you're debating, you're sleeping, whatever you do. This is going. This is the cultural practice of what we do right now. I'm teaching you something, and you're teaching me, not the least. But we could look at this particular practice right now, and then we could look at it in a theoretical workshop, as a methodological workshop, and as an empirical workshop. And going through these 3 workshops, just focusing on 1 or 2, we could get an idea of how is theory and practice related as we speak right now. How do we understand what is the of courseness of theory and practice right now? And let's say that we use a relation between theory and practice that strikes you as not very fruitful. Or maybe it strikes me as we are moving towards something that is not that good. We need to transgress what we are doing, what's so obvious. And in order to change that thinking, behavior, organization, whatever, we need creativity. And in order to get out of these customs, traditions, we need to view that creative processes in this perspective could said to be consisting of that whenever you are in a creative process, you are immersed, you are part of the topic of interest, you are part of the traditions, you are being part of the subject matter. But what also happens when you are in a creative process is that you make experiments and you do some inquiry learning. Maybe you are cheating a little bit. Maybe you are doing something behind the lecturer's back that will help you understand, or maybe understand it in a new way, what's going on right now. And what you also will face is that you will face some resistance when you are doing creative process. Material will not move exactly as you want it to. And this resistance could actually be very inspiring, because this will force you to think anew. But looking at the workshops, we've been through the theory and practice understandings. So looking at the workshops, what is a theoretical workshop? A theoretical workshop is something, is a place where, and this could be at campus, it could be at internship, it could be at the playground, it could be anywhere you want. But a theoretical workshop is a workshop where you especially focus on what notions, concepts, models are we using in this particular setting. What is taken for granted and what is challenging? What is it that I need to know to be in this situation? Saying I'm an internship as a nurse, what's challenging me right now? Everybody else seems to know what's going on. I don't know anything. But the nurse could also look at the situation from a methodological point of view. What are the methods we are using right now? How do we get our data? How do we get the knowledge we know right now? And how do we get this in order to make some advice for actions? And you can also look at what goes on in this situation from an empirical point of view. What kind of material do we have on our hands right now? We have these chairs and tables and this crazy room with all the glass and stuff. There are some pupils inside the room, or there are some grown-ups, and they do something, they know something, they wish something. What is planned in this room right now? What is planned through, and what is evaluated? So it's a breakdown of what is this situation of right now. So what is taken for granted? What is so obvious? What is the of courseness of what's going on in this particular setting? That is somehow analyzed through these particular workshops. And this is something that we could use in any part of our education to cast a light on the qualities of what we do. So that sometimes when my students say to me, well, okay, Lars, it's okay that you want me to go in this dialectical direction for viewing the relationships between theory and practice, but I do not know what to do with my pupils. They are yelling and screaming. What sort of advice do you want me to take on? And I wouldn't know. So whatever I'm doing in that particular situation, when I'm teaching didactics, I'm also forced with some limits of what is reasonable when I teach didactics. And the students will sometimes raise their hands and say, now, there are limits to the logic of what you're saying right now. And these limits are that you are not able to give us any kind of advice. And in a situation like this, it could be interesting to move on to say, okay, well, maybe that's because I'm debating didactics at the moment right now, not from a point of view where advices are very natural. We are only talking about theory and practice in a dialectical perspective. But if we could move on to a relationship between theory and practice where advice would be more obvious, then we need to be aware that this is what we do then. Okay, let's move on to that. So, what is the point is also that, I will go to this one, is that the student is forcing me to change, to think creatively of what I'm doing as he's giving me some resistance. He's saying, Lars, you're not going anywhere with what you're saying that I can use for anything. So he's forcing me to think differently. So I'm forced to transgress the dialectical perspective I have on didactics. And the point is that we need to be aware as we change, that we do change. And we also need to acknowledge that sometimes it's okay to have no relationships between theory and practice, because this is what is more obvious for learning this particular content, say grammar or theoretical physics or whatever it could be. Right?
You said if a student told you that what you were saying was useless, in that perspective, isn't that actually a pretty good result? Because if the student concludes that what you're saying is useless, they must have an internal landscape of what can be used. So that is a pretty positive learning process. So why are you forced to change something?
Sure.
Couldn't that be fine?
I'm not saying I need to go in his direction. Sure. What I'm saying is that I could go in his direction. And if I do, and this is often what happens when students are saying, we need to boycott you because this is so stupid what you're saying. We sometimes think to ourselves, perhaps they're right. But I get your drift. But it's not a matter of that I necessarily go in his direction. It's a matter of me acknowledging, well, there are other ways of looking at the relationship between theory and praxis than the one that I'm practicing right now. In his perspective, our students are at internship at 1.5 to 2 months every year. So they are once in a while very, very focused on that they have to teach. They're very focused on that it has to be a success. It has to be very well planned, and they cannot fall through. So they're very oriented towards what are the advices I can give for good teaching. And maybe sometimes they are too focused on these advices. Because sometimes, maybe, let's go back, slide 2. Maybe some of them will need, I need some evidence for what is good practice. And I will argue from another perspective, there is no evidence. But you can be more clever, you can be more smart, you can be more experienced, trying out different ways of teaching. But there's nothing in the world that would guarantee you that this will be a success every time. And then we will have other lectures at my campus who will say, no, Lars, that is completely not true. There are evidence-based learning. It's just a matter of reading right books. And this is what really makes up our study programs, is that we have these different ways of looking how theory and practice are related, but we don't necessarily have the tools for saying, okay, these are the actual differences between us. So if I was to end this long speech, and now I made some mistakes, I wish to say that lecturers, students and mentors should learn to view the different understandings of the theory and practice by identifying them in their own daily practice. So it's not necessarily a matter of changing your theory and practice relationship, but it's a matter of saying, now I understand why you ask this question. So we can use this situation right now for a workshop where we can discuss and debate what relations of theory and practice are we using right now. And what I'm saying is that these different theory and practice relations or understandings are manifested in different ways of reading, understanding, analyzing, arguing, and they're guided by different cultures that lecturers, students and mentors live in. So when I'm arguing from a dialectical perspective, it's because I sort of am a part of a particular culture where that is the most obvious. And it's an understanding of, yeah, I'll get to that. And my point is also that all understandings are worthful and cannot be replaced by others. So there's none of these understandings that you should skip or rule out or you'll never get back to. But not all understandings are equally fruitful in every context, and they may therefore be challenged. And theory and practice didactics can analyze content-specific didactics, let's say math, by identifying their theory and practice understandings and relations to the other subjects that may, for example, be history. And what I wish to say as final comment is that hereby we develop a meter's perspective on didactics. And it's developed by viewing every content-specific didactical notion as part of a whole. So what we face is that when we look at how these theory and practice understandings once in a while are met, they are met in clashes, they are met in different organizations, and they strive for recognition. So the theory and practice didactics is trying to develop a third point where you can stand and look down on why are we clashing right now, why are we disagreeing right now. So it's trying to develop a meta perspective on education. Yes, that was it for me. If you have any questions, you're welcome.
I might have some. Is there, you mentioned that you have analyzed BA programs, and by that you mean the texts guiding, I mean the actual...
Also the text, yes.
Also the text. Would there be anything in ways of tools or methodologies or the way you looked at it that could be used in building BA, what was that? BA,
Courses,
yeah, courses, BA programs, yeah.
Yeah.
At the level of the document.
Well, I was the guy who was speaking from a dialectical point of view, right? So I have no advice.
I have something I'll show the day after tomorrow.
Great.
You have?
Yeah.
That's good. No, I have no particular advice for writing curriculums or writing study programs. Modules. No, I don't. But I just wish to argue that whenever you use the term theory and practice, you sort of need to light a bulb above your head, or remember that theory and practice are not just related in the manner you may think. Theory and practice could be related in many ways. And now I've listed 4. But you could list many others. This is just one way of organizing 4 analytical ways of organizing. So I'm just saying, when you do write your curriculum, and you write theory and practice are related through the internship, because this is where you get very clever, because you can use all the stuff you've learned at the campus. Yeah, right, okay. But is it that obvious when you're in it? Is it that obvious that when you're in internship that you can just use whatever you've learned? Not necessarily very obvious. Maybe you're only using what is headed precisely at action. So we have leaders at this school who makes evaluations once in a while. They say, oh, the students say there's no relations between theory and practice, there's no bridge, blah, blah, blah. And that's true. That's true. Because it's not possible to make a bridge between every theory and every practice. It is not possible. Because that is not how theory and practice necessarily works. And this is not necessarily impossible to say in advance, because the particular context that you move into could strive at particular ways of looking at theory and practice.
I have one last question, and then I'll stop. You mentioned can you show us a slide with the different philosophical? Yeah, that one. You mentioned the polarity one, which has there are two polarities, and then you can have like a setting of maybe more to one polarity than the other. Am I right? Okay. So that would be kind of like the idea of a balance, really. That there is a balance, and it has to be set somewhere, the balance between theory and practice. Wouldn't that be fair to say that?
It's not actually like that. More or less something like that. It's not a matter of balance. It's a matter of that when you start arguing in this polarity perspective, you don't start arguing from a theoretical perspective. And you don't start arguing from a practice perspective. You start arguing from a perspective that where you want a specific product. You want a result. And the result you get, and that could be either very close to practice, or that could be either very close to practice. That is where theory and practice meet. Yeah. So it's supposed to be understood in that manner. But I know that that particular theory and practice understanding can be a bit tricky.
I have one association when I listen to you because